Welcome everyone to our webinar series, Building Sustainable Futures, Global Challenges and Possibilities, where each quarter we consider a different United Nations Sustainable Development Goal. I'm Klaus Weber, I'm the Deputy Director of the Northwestern Buffett Institute for Global Affairs. In our series this winter has focused on SDG 13, climate action. It's also co-sponsored by ISON, the Institute of Sustainability and Energy at Northwestern, and SustainU. Today we're really excited, and I'm very honored to welcome Mike Hulme, who is a professor in human geography at the University of Cambridge in the UK. And I've personally admired his work for quite some while and observed it. His work illuminates the numerous ways in which the idea of climate change is deployed, contested, debated, and understood and made meaningful in public settings and in private understandings. So it gives us a really interesting behind the scenes look at the notion of climate change that in the SDG takes on a very specific meaning and explores the basis of climate action in an understanding of people's narratives and meanings and what action actually means in that context. Mike has authored 9 different books on climate change. He's been very involved in many of the debates around it, has been a founding director of the interdisciplinary Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research in the UK. And we're very, very excited to have him today and share your thoughts. So I'll turn it over to Mike. And we use the same format as always. Mike will give us a presentation and overview, and then we'll get into Q&A. So if you have questions, you post them in the chat, and then I will relay them in the Q&A session. Over to you, Mike.
Okay, thank you very much, Klaus, and the chance to share with your lunchtime seminar today. I just need to quickly do the screen share, I think. So we get that up on screen. Okay, so why storytelling is key to climate action. And my starting point really is to say that climate change has evolved into something much larger than originally envisaged, I would suggest, by scientists back in the 1960s and the 1970s. Certainly when I first started studying climate change in the 1980s as a scientist working on climate data and climate models. And because the idea of climate change has grown and evolved in shape and size and reach and significance over recent decades, my more recent work is very much interested in thinking through this idea of climate change and how it intersects with other facets of human cultural life, political life, and indeed how it enters into our imaginations in relation to the future. And so this talk is one that focuses on one element of how we might approach this idea of climate change, and that is through the idea of story and storytelling. And I start off with this particular framing of climate change that we will have recognized in the last 2 or 3 years. This is through the voice of Greta Thunberg. And from these quotes here, you see a very particular way in which she has presented herself in public life very prominently in the last couple of years here, referring to herself that there's a little bit of black and white thinking in the way that she approaches climate change. It's one thing or the other, and there's no space in between the black and the white. And that leads her to her refrain that we will often hear is about listening to scientists or listening to science. And I use this as a starting point because it actually is one particular framing of climate change which we can recognize that goes back further in the recent past, when commentators and interlocutors talk about the science saying this or the science saying that. I use this headline from the publication of the 4th assessment report of the IPCC back in 2007. This was on the front page of our Guardian newspaper here in the UK. The vast report, i.e. the IPCC, will end the scientific argument. Now will the world act? Here, a former chair of the IPCC, Rachendra Pachari, all we need is the will to change, which we trust will be motivated by an understanding of the science of climate change. Or even more recently here, the People's Climate March. Science stands for climate action. The debate is over, the facts are in, the evidence is clear. So this is what I would call a science-first way of thinking about climate change. And it has a certain resonance with a particular reading of what science is, or what sort of cultural authority science may have in contemporary societies. But my argument would be that this way of framing climate change is asking science to do the impossible. And Dan Sarowitz illustrates this quite nicely in an essay he wrote a few years ago, thinking about the expectations for Enlightenment ideals of applying rationality are themselves irrational. We're asking science to do the impossible, to arrive at scientifically coherent and politically unifying understandings of problems that are inherently open, indeterminate, and contested. And more philosophically, this is from my colleague Tim Lewin's his book here at the University of Cambridge on his popular introduction to science, The Meaning of Science. He says there's no chance that science will ever tell us all that we need to know if we are to understand our world, to live well, and to make wise decisions. So this science-first approach, this rhetoric of listening to science, doing what scientists tell us to do, seems to me to be somewhat self-defeating. Self-defeating from a tactical point of view, but also I think it misses something really important about how the human thinks and acts and imagines themselves to be in the world. And that is why I, in this talk, want to draw attention to the power of stories, because acting on climate change actually takes us beyond what science can instruct us to do. Indeed, science doesn't instruct us to do anything. It simply is a good way of revealing how the physical world works. It doesn't carry along with it, inevitably, particular normative principles of how we should or should not behave. And therefore, at the heart of climate change, and this is something that certainly in my own career, only slowly and gradually over the 40 years that I've been studying this has become ever clearer to me. But at the very heart of climate change are these age-old questions that humans, ever since we've been able to reflect and to contemplate in social and cultural settings, have been central to our deliberation. How should we live? How do humans live? How should we live? How do societies work through their disagreements, through public issues? What sorts of duties do we have to others, human others, who are distant in time and space, but also non-human others as well? And then what are the types of political structures and institutions that we believe are effective and just in helping us to work through these dilemmas of living well together in complex social formations? And so my own work, Why We Disagree About Climate Change, explored some of these questions. Others too, in the last decade or so, have written about climate change in this way, presenting it not first and foremost as a matter for science to adjudicate on, but actually situating climate change as a social phenomena, and therefore its responses and solutions can therefore only also be social. Now, some people, of course, have taken this idea of storying around climate change literally. So again, we've seen in the last 10 years, 10 or 15 years in particular, the growth of what Adeline Johns-Putra has called the climate novel. And there's a subgenre of literary fiction now called cli-fi, climate fiction. Two of the early examples of this were Ian McEwan's book Solar, or Barbara Kingsolver with her very successful books like Behavior. And these used the tools and the devices of creative writers to think about how do you tell climate change as a story through literary fiction, through creative fiction. And others have written about the challenges of actually doing this in effective ways. It's been a challenge, and various literary critics have found fault with both Ian McEwan's approach and with Kingsolver's way of telling the story of climate change through creative fiction. But that's one way of thinking about stories and storytelling, to dig deeper into the ways in which humans and human societies think about climate change. There are other ways as well. There are other types of stories that I think are fruitful and important to pursue. So thinking in terms of genre, what types of story do we think climate change is pointing us to? Is it a comedy, a drama, an epic, a tragedy? So people like Alex Evans have written about the importance of myths, rediscovering or reinventing myths that help societies today to navigate through the complex questions and challenges that climate change presents us with. There are eco-linguists who have studied this from a more formal linguistic perspective to explore the types of words or word structures and formations through which the idea of climate change is narrated in public life. The point here is that climate change, it mobilizes very different types of ideologies and meanings and values and goals. And stories are powerful ways that humans have developed, evolved over thousands of years in order to structure their understanding of their place in the world and their relationships with others and their ethical and moral duties. And that's why, for me, thinking of climate change through story is particularly powerful and appropriate, and I would say necessary if we are to think constructively about how, in terms of policies and politics, we find and navigate our way through the challenges and risks that climate change presents to us. And I'll say a word about that at the very end of the talk. But before I get there, I just want to very briefly run through 10 stories, if you will, 10 ways of thinking about climate change as a story that have different resonances in different political cultures, in different constituencies within our own culture. These are stories that attach more powerfully to some ideologies or cultural dispositions than to others, but I think they are recognizable as narratives that circulate in our contemporary world today. So the first of them is the story of scientific progress, and this, one often hears this representation of climate change. It is a science-first story, but it's a story of how science has achieved in its understanding and knowledge of how the climate system operates, but also the particular role and function that humans and human societies have in that climate system. The IPCC obviously is a very important conduit for this type of a story, and one can look at the particular reports of the IPCC to see how it self-represents its own triumphs as a movement of science towards ever-growing knowledge. So I just picked out some words here that back in the first assessment report, it was about narrowing uncertainties, then it was about advancing understanding, then it was about focusing on key uncertainties, pointing towards gaps and studies, gaps in data and studies that remain to be done. or about calibrated language. So this is a very particular and actually got a very frequently repeated story of climate change, how science has become ever increasingly confident and sure and certain about what is happening to our climate system and the influence of humans on that system as it goes into the future. The second story, which again is a fairly dominant one, I would suggest, is the story of market failure. The economist's framing of what the problem of climate change really is. Nick Stern, in his economist report from 2007 for the British government, really made this crystal clear. The very first sentence of that 700-page report was that climate change is the greatest example of market failure we have ever seen. And that narrative that if climate change is caused by a market failure, it therefore then can be corrected by an intervention in the marketplace, is the internal logic of this particular story. Climate change then becomes a business opportunity where the carbon market is the key, getting the right price on carbon, whether through direct pricing, through regulatory taxes, or indirectly through schemes, market-based schemes like carbon trading with indirect prices. Nevertheless, having a price on carbon is the way in which this failure can be corrected, and therefore climate change can be brought to heel. A third story focuses very much more on the idea of energy transitions or energy innovation. That really what is the heart of this story is the move of 21st century society away from fossil-based energy economies to renewable energy economies. This is the transition narrative, the German energy revolution. This is the promise held out by commentators like Mark Jacobson, who argues that it is possible to provide the entire world energy needs through 100% wind, water, and solar. It also partly is the story that Bill Gates recently illuminated in his latest book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, where first and foremost for Gates is the promise of energy innovation, displacing fossil out of the energy system in order to meet the growing and future demands of the world for energy. And this is a particularly potent story. It appeals to particular constituencies that we can recognize around our societies. A fourth story, though, around climate change is rather different, perhaps. It's a story of lament and loss. And I perhaps was first exposed to this myself when I read Bill McKibben's book, 1989, The End of Nature, when he placed climate change very much in this lament for the loss of a world, a natural world that was distinct and different from the artificial worlds and manipulated worlds of human artifice. And this quote from the Camp for Climate Action sort of is an elegy for a nature that has passed, for a climate that now inexorably carries the fingerprints of humanity. So they will say there was a kind of certainty to our lives in the past, but the cuckoos are now disappearing, and it seems that all the patterns of the world are being scrambled. And this is a way of telling the story of climate change in this elegiac form. The idea of the Anthropocene, of course, has sort of come in as a sideswipe, if you will, to, and depending on how one interprets the very idea of the Anthropocene, it draws attention to the inextricable entanglement between human technologies and societies with natural functions. If indeed these were ever separate, one certainly can no longer pretend that one can create or maintain nature as distinct and separate from human activity. That can either be seen as a progressive moment of enlightenment, or indeed, for those who look back on the loss of nature, it can be seen as a sad indictment on what humanity has done to the planet. But either way, it creates a story around lament and loss, an instinct to try to recover something that is gone. A very different story around climate change is this: is a story. Climate change is a story of liberal conspiracy, and we well recognize this story. It's taken on various shapes and forms over 25 years or so now. that either the whole idea that humans are influencing the global climate system is dodgy science, or that if humans are having an influence on the climate system, it's a relatively minor influence relative to natural variability in the climate system. And so on that premise, one builds an edifice of argumentation that is critical of certain political instincts, certain forms of government intervention within the operating of late modern societies. So this narrative, the story, again, is a powerful one. It's had influence, at least in some quarters, over the last 20 or 30 years, even if it also actually over time has evolved and taken off in a number of rather different directions. Nevertheless, it's a reactionary narrative against the very idea that climate change is something that we should take particularly seriously. Contrasting with that, with my my next story, it then shows the starkness of just how different we can recognize these stories that are in circulation. Here, climate change becomes a story of resistance and struggle. This is a reaction against what some have argued to be the post-political framing of climate change. But for these interlocutors, what is necessary is to use climate change actually to reanimate, to motivate, incentivize the political struggle against capitalism and against the incumbent powers that perpetuate the capitalist system, which puts profit before the lives of billions of humans and the planet itself. Naomi Klein's work in her 2014 book is a representation of this. But we see also this coming from a variety of parts of the political spectrum, where people argue that a form of eco-socialism is actually the only way in which climate change is going to be arrested. Any notion that one can continue with capitalist structures and incentives and at the same time arrest climate change is mere delusion. So this is totally orthogonal to the idea of pricing carbon through carbon markets. One cannot hold both of those two stories at the same time. Then my seventh story, the story of hothouse Earth, which stands in for a more dark reading of the climate future, I would suggest. A future of inexorable and inevitable decline, deterioration, if not collapse in the basic functions of the Earth system, and the associated collapse in the basic tenets of civilization itself. And we've seen this given a particular form of expression through Extinction Rebellion in the last 2 or 3 years, through narratives that have taken inspiration from that, like Wallace Wells's The Uninhabitable Earth, or Jem Bendel's very popular web publication, Deep Adaptation, which itself has fueled a lot of the movement of Extinction Rebellion. As Mayor Hillman, the British commentator, said, we're doomed. With such a beaming smile that it takes a moment for the words to sink in. The outcome is death, and it's the end of most of life on the planet. This is a very particular story, a story of extinction, of collapse, of endings, which has a certain power, and maybe an alluring power even, to the way in which it is narrated. And it has led to, and this is sort of an associated story, but this is a very particular manifestation. It takes that doomist declensionist narrative to its ultimate extreme. This is from a cultural organization that was set up just after the failure of the Copenhagen summit back in 2009, the Dark Mountain Project in the UK. Paul Kingsnorth is one of the founders of this. And indeed, for him, what climate change points to, what the story of climate change is an ending of civilization itself. People who have stopped believing in the conventional narratives about the future. We want to start unweaving the myths that underpin our civilization and that are leading us to destruction. So this is, as I said, a dark reading. It's called the Dark Mountain Project because it is a dark reading, but it is a story. It's presenting climate change in this narrative form, which appeals to some of our storied instincts as human beings. And then two final stories to conclude. And again, there's some elements of earlier thinking here in this story. The story of technological mastery. This is different from the energy revolution, the energy transition, because this is a story of using technology not to displace fossil fuel or to restructure or to reorganize social institutions or economic production. This is a story of using technology as a brute force solution, putting a thermostat on the planet, if you will, as a metaphor. Climate engineering, in particular climate engineering through aerosol injection. This is something that human societies can do. It's a relatively cheap intervention. It probably is likely to be quite effective at reducing global temperature. It's mimicking the actions of volcanoes by spraying particles into the stratosphere. And it therefore takes control of planetary temperature through a particular form of technology. It's a master narrative in more senses than one, and it generates very strong reactions in different directions, both those who would argue that that type of intervention should be banned entirely, as opposed to those who really see it's important to establish the potential for solar climate engineering as a plan B or as a backstop solution for climate change. And then my final story, again, very different from many of the previous stories. This is a story of human transformation. And it was given very good expression and articulation by Pope Francis in his encyclical from 2015, Laudato Si, or Care for Our Common Home. And here what Pope Francis was doing was telling the story of climate change through the eyes of Catholic theology, Catholic cosmology, Catholic social theology, and pointing to the underlying argument that climate change was not a problem of technology or even a problem of capitalism. It was actually a problem of the human spirit that modernity has turned and distorted in ways that lead to these dysfunctions, both within society and the impacts that societies have on the natural world. And as he said here, reading climate change in this particular way requires that we look for solutions not only in technology, but in the change of humanity. Otherwise, we'd be dealing merely with the symptoms. So for Pope Francis, this is a spiritual crisis, and therefore requires a spiritual transformation. And again, for particular constituencies, this has a certain power and appeal to the particular narrative arc that Pope Francis offers. So those are 10 stories. They have greater or lesser degrees of intersection or overlap with each other, and they have greater degrees of hegemony or marginalization. Some are more dominant than others, for sure. But they are stories, I would argue, that have been brought forward by different actors, and they all in different ways appeal because they situate climate change in a larger set of associations between our imaginations, our spirituality, our sense of ethical responsibility, our political instincts, our ideologies, and our values, which is exactly, of course, what stories always do. They find a way of connecting in a narrative form between all those elements of what it is to be human in a complex world. And so to conclude then, what I'm sort of suggesting here is two different ways of approaching climate change. The science first, reading climate change forwards, if you will, or reading it from science. So you start with the science, the observation, the detection, the attribution, and you end up on that trajectory of social engineering. What stories do, I would suggest, or one of the things that stories do, is to invert that line of reasoning. That actually we start with our stories, these ways of making sense of our place in the world and our sense of ethical, moral, and political responsibility, our beliefs, our values, our goals. And then the evidence around climate change is mobilized in order to provide forms and directions in which we can mobilize within social movements, within political institutions, in order to realize those goals that are motivated and inspired by the stories to which we are committed. There are very different ways of approaching climate change. And so when we think about climate actions, climate activities, climate responses, my point is that actually situating them within a bigger story, finding the narrative, and recognizing, of course, that your narrative is not going to be a universal narrative. It's not necessarily shared across all 8 billion people on the planet. And so the reason this is important then, when it comes to policy making, to politics, is that we need to recognize that these different stories are in circulation and to listen to them, to pay attention to the different stories that people bring into this political arena. And this final quote is from a colleague again here at Cambridge, Sarah Dillon. She's just finished writing a book with Claire Craig called Story Listening. And why actually their argument in that book is that this is a really important skill to learn for policymakers and for politicians, to listen to the sorts of stories that people bring forward about issues like climate change. They apply it to other complex policy issues as well, for example, like artificial intelligence. But to listen to people's stories, to recognize that in a diverse and fractious society, there are going to be different stories that capture different social values and norms. But good policy making is going to be predicated on good story listening, to attend to the different stories that people have and that animate and motivate them to become political actors and to secure and to achieve their goals in particular ways. So I will finish there. Very welcome to take some questions and points of discussion. Thank you for joining us today.
Excellent. And thank you so much for a very succinct and very compelling presentation of it. The questions are streaming in, and I want to tackle one sort of nexus of questions and comments that revolves around the question of how, to what extent those stories are sort of embedded or situated in social structures and social contexts. And one way to think about this is to what extent are narratives of marginalized groups, indigenous groups, groups that are more or less affected by climate change, that have more or less of a stake. To what extent do the narratives map onto a social and political world? And what does that imply for being heard, or the importance of being heard, and how to get heard? So I know it's a very complex question, but I wanted to give you a sense of where a number of comments come from, and maybe you can just sort of comment on that, because you presented them primarily as narratives without sort of situating them in a sort of political and social structure.
Yeah, well, I mean, all of those in different ways emerge from particular each of those stories. Let's put it this way: each of those stories has got a historical dimension to them. You can trace those particular narratives back historically in different political cultures, and that's why some of them, have greater power. I guess they have greater connectivity to institutions and individuals who are powerful than others. Some of them are much more explicitly countercultural than others. So, for example, the Dark Mountain Project, it frames itself as being countercultural. That's its raison d'etre, is to challenge, basic cultural assumptions about progress and enlightenment that have driven 300 years of particularly Western development under the rubric of progress. So in that sense, they're deliberately challenging these dominant cultural powers. And I think the other thing I'd say is about all of them have complex relationships with scientific knowledge. And obviously the first one is framed explicitly as a scientific story. It's about the triumph of science to reveal and articulate the influence that humans are having on the climate system. But all the other 9 stories have got complex relationships with science, such that, for example, the climate change as a liberal conspiracy is very skeptical of a particular manifestation of science. The hothouse Earth narrative has, I would say, a very distinct way of interpreting the uncertainties in Earth system science. The climate change as a human transformation through a religious lens will take science very seriously, but actually put science on a subordinate level to a higher normative goal, which is in some sense about human emancipation and spiritual integrity. So they all have complex relationships with science. And yet, where I started off is very interesting, how certainly for much of the time I've been studying climate change, science has been seen as the starting point, which is exactly the rhetoric that Thunberg refers to. It. She keeps coming back, well, listen to science, listen to scientists, do what the scientists say. But that doesn't really get beyond that. And it doesn't really begin to articulate the different ways in which these different political actors and constituencies and narratives relate to science in these quite complex ways. Science, of course, is used as a form of cultural authority for many. It would be the ultimate authority. But I don't think that's a universal view. Certainly if you look at, or you listen to indigenous narratives, or narratives of climate change that emerge from marginalized or indigenous cultures, they will have a much more complex relationship with science. And again, science is perhaps even placed on a subordinate level in comparison to their historical political reading of their oppression and marginalization that they've experienced over 200 years of colonialism. So I think the place of science in all of these stories I'm offering is really interesting to untangle as well. And it certainly is the reason why I start off by saying that science is not really a particularly helpful way of finding one's way through all of these different particular readings of climate change. It's not the sword of Damocles that cuts through the Gordian knot. It doesn't make these political and cultural disagreements go away.
Is there, I mean, does this go further? I mean, does climate science itself would look different, or would need to be different if you start from the stories, from the other 9 stories? Or is it just a separate sphere, and then it's a matter of, you know, the traditional science communication idea that we do the science, then we figure out how we sell it to different audiences? Or is there a more fundamental sort of question about how the science itself gets done?
No, that's a really interesting question, because there certainly would be some who would say that they would maybe take, you know, they would take my stories or other people's stories. I'm not saying that they're my invention at all, but a strategic science communication program around the IPCC, for example, would take these different stories, these different narratives seriously, and frame the reports of the IPCC in particular ways, with particular interlocutors, particular communicators, who, as it were, would speak for the IPCC according to these different storylines. I mean, a very explicit one of this has been the success of Katharine Hayhoe in the USA as an evangelical Christian, a climate scientist, but even an evangelical Christian, and using that particular cultural identity, religious identity, in order to communicate the science of the IPCC in ways that seek to resonate with evangelical Christian audiences. And indeed, there's a lot of, you know, social science, social psychology research, you know, that's been done around this. Dan Kahan's work in particular, that shows that the idea of the trusted communicator, that if you're trying to communicate science to particular forms of political or cultural identities, then you need to find speakers, communicators, interlocutors who resonate with your audience. So you could approach the whole frame of my talk, if you like, through a way of enhancing science communication to make it more effective. I think that rather misses the point to a degree of what I'm saying, because science itself is its own narrative, it's its own story. You know, a very successful story within its own terms of remit, which is a way of inquiring into how the physical world functions. We perhaps haven't found a better way of trying to understand how physical systems function, and offer predictions of them. It doesn't tell the whole story about the human place on the planet. And certainly, if you then start in thinking, well, how are indigenous knowledge cultures, how are they represented, or how are they accommodated within the IPCC? Then you begin to realize the limits of this approach. That how indigenous cultures may approach environmental change, whether it's climatic or biodiversity in local ecosystems, will adopt rather different paradigms of knowledge than would be recognized in a science lab in Western institutions. So I don't think it's not a case just of improving science communication. I think it's about recognizing that the complex interplay between knowledge, values, beliefs requires a different way of combining those together, and stories are very effective and powerful ways of doing that, and they provide the basis, and very often have done. It's the stories that provide the basis for social and political mobilization. I would argue it's not science itself that provides that motivational power. It's the stories that are constructed around that, that provide that motivation for political and social change.
So if I understand you right, it's more that each story is a partial story rather than a you know, an encompassing story that could put an endpoint to it. Is that?
Yeah, I think so. And if you approach this then through you know, theories of political, you know, through political theory or theories of deliberation right. in complex societies, you know, to take the extreme, if climate change really was simply about the science and getting the science right and listening to the scientists, as Greta Thunberg wants us to do, then it really is just a case of, you know, the linear model of science communication. We want to get, and this is why I'm slightly critical of what's sometimes referred to as the consensus messaging. If only we could get 97% of our public to understand that 97% of scientists agree, then that's the problem solved. Mm-hmm. If you can just drive that message incessantly, then you cut through all of this complex stuff. But in a political, in an open, complex, a deliberative society where people bring very different values and beliefs and goals to the table, you've got to find other ways of reconciling between those different outlooks. And just driving through science as though that will provide the solution, it's not a particular way I read political theory or political deliberation or democratic deliberation. You've got to give space to these different stories, to understand them on their own terms. That doesn't mean you suspend judgment and you treat them all equally, but you do have to give space and listen and understand where these stories are coming from. And I think, you know, there's another point here that can be made about the rise of political populism. You know, if you want to go down that route, why in the last 5 or more years in both Western liberal democracies have we seen the rise of political populism? Is it because certain stories, certain ways of people seeing themselves and their identities and their social networks in the world have seemed to be dismissed or marginalized by elites? And this is why, coming back to the point I made at the end about this book from Claire Craig and Sarah Dillon about story listening, it's exactly why the argument they make for good policy making. Yes, you need to listen to the scientists, but you need to listen to the storytellers in your society. Who are the people who've got the powerful stories? Why are they telling the story that they tell in the way that they do? How are they feeling? How are they weaving together their own sense of identity and their normative beliefs and values? Good policy making requires good story listening.
Now, and this perfect transition to a few of the points that in that context. I mean, some people would argue that we live in a world where listening is not exactly our strength or is encouraged by our institutions and by our, you know, communication technologies. Are there examples where listening, especially at a global scale, has taken place, does take place, where those narratives are put into play and where people actually actively try to learn it? This is purely from if we want sort of larger change or larger action, the listening part seems to be very critical, and this is a very practical question about just where does it happen, what needs to be in place for it to happen to be effective.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not a Twitter user, so I observe, from the outside. But my sense is that there's not too much listening that often goes on Twitter. There's a lot of proclaiming and denouncing, but not some sustained listening, I would suggest. So I think that, and this points to a bigger issue, of course, as technology, social communication technologies have changed. On the one hand, we can hear more voices. There are more voices to be heard, which is the emancipatory potential of these communication platforms. On the other hand, I'm not sure that the quality of that listening, as I say, is anything to be admirable. And if you contrast that, if you will, with the origin of human storytelling, if you understand the evolutionary anthropologists, the idea of the storytelling within small communities of repeated oral accounts that creates a sense of identity and togetherness and cooperation in the face of external threats. It's a very embodied way in which these stories emerge and how they get repeated from generation to generation. It becomes very incorporated in people's identity. That's a long way away from where we are with Twitter, it would seem to me. I think another dimension of how we can cultivate better listening is actually in our school systems, particularly in our infant and junior, very early ages, to cultivate good listening in the classroom. My wife is a junior school teacher, and in recent years she's become very involved with something called Philosophy for Children, P4C, which is intended even for children as young as 4 and 5 in the classroom setting to engage in philosophical discussions, appropriate, of course, to that age, but it's around recognizing that all of the 20 or 30 kids, and she set some very, very simple questions that can engage a 5-year-old's mind, but to listen and to offer reasons why they may think stealing Goldilocks's porridge in the Three Bears is a bad thing to do. Why is it wrong to steal? Or you can open up really deep and important philosophical questions in the minds of 4 or 5-year-olds, and that cultivates skills of listening and also skills of respect, of course. That people, you can respect people who may have completely different views to you, but if you can do that in a safe context, where you recognize the shared humanity of your opponents, then you've actually cultivated lifelong learning that hopefully can be converted into broader forms of public deliberation later on. So I think the classroom, understanding how different cultures narrate and listen. But I'm not particularly optimistic from what I observe about the quality of listening in our contemporary Western societies at all.
How about at the global level? So I'm thinking of the sort of major institutions that are involved in, the climate change. This whole webinar series is sort of takes the SDGs as a starting point, and the United Nations organizations, intergovernmental organizations.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. You look at some of the international settings within which climate change has been discussed and debated. Certainly the annual conferences of the parties. I mean, those have evolved over 30 years from something that did start off as quite narrowly aimed at intergovernmental negotiation between diplomats and professionals, to actually over the last 30 years they've become, and obviously last year's conference was abandoned. This is going to happen again in Glasgow in November, but they've become platforms for multiple voices to participate, and actually the formal diplomatic procedural negotiations in a sense become less significant than the actual broader sets of interactions and engagements that occur around the margins of those international settings, whether it's from civil society or for corporate business or for indigenous communities or for religious organizations. You actually have the multiplicity, the proliferation of stories in those international settings. And I think maybe just one word about the SDGs, given that your series is framed with the SDGs. I often contrast the SDGs with climate change, in the sense that the SDGs have, if you will, many more degrees of freedom to accommodate different stories. I mean, obviously at the basic level, there are 17 top-level goals. rather than one single goal that drives the Paris Agreement. And then below the 17 goals, there are multiple subsidiary goals. And in a sense, by having multiple goals in operation at any single time, it actually allows, there are more points of articulation to allow different political actors who might very well not agree on, if you collapse the SDGs into one single goal, it would become much harder to actually find constituencies of political actors that could cooperate together. But the more points of articulation you have, then the more possible it is to accommodate different stories, different priorities about what really constitutes the good life or a particular normative aspiration. So I often think that, in a sense, that climate change should be completely subsumed under the SDGs, and the SDGs should have the same prominence and potency that climate change has in international politics, which I don't think it does. I think climate change has its own, it's got its own momentum behind it. Whereas actually it would be really neat if one could somehow flip that around and invest all of this political momentum around climate change into the SDGs, because I just think that politically they're more amenable to constructive interventions and actions, not because they will all be met, or that somehow a world, even with them all met, would somehow be perfect. But it just increases the possibility for constructive political cooperation and progress. And it sort of fits with my notion of multiple stories, that you can find these different points of articulation and cooperation between actors that may not agree about everything, but they can agree about a much more specific objective.
I'm going to bring us back as we're reaching the end of our hour to two more sort of, I'm going to put them as sort of more pointed questions, but they address the sort of the relationship between the different stories and the status of the different stories. And one is simply, so is the goal to reach consensus and come up with a common story, or should we actually cultivate the diversity? The second one, some of them seem, if you believe that there is a need for climate action, seem less constructive or less potent to actually accomplish that, whereas others do. And so are they all equally good, or are there some that we simply don't want, or, from a personal perspective, that you'd rather live without some?
Yeah, well, the first point about whether somehow there's a master narrative, there's a master story. I mean, we've moved away from master narratives. Certainly in Western modernity, we no longer believe in the master narrative. Although actually, I mean, as a I'm a self-identified Christian, and I've got a certain sympathy actually for the way that Pope. I'm not a Catholic, I'm a Protestant, but I've got a certain sympathy for the ambition of Pope Francis's encyclical, in the sense that he provided, in some senses, his account of the challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss is the most ambitious narrative of the lot. in the sense he offers a cosmological vision. He's very respectful of science. He takes science seriously, but he also digs deeper into different sources of ethical and moral and human reasoning about why we should act in particular ways. But not everybody is going to become a follower of the Pope. And actually, of course, this is the problem with any attempt at a master narrative. There were some colleagues of mine in my previous institution, King's College London, a few years ago, who wrote a little commentary piece in Nature Climate Change, saying that what the world needs is a single strategic narrative around climate change. They came at this from a defense studies point of view. So they look at the way the military operate under conditions of conflict and war, and they took this idea of the master strategy, that if you're going to be victorious in war, you have to organize not just your military forces behind a single goal, a master goal, but you have to organize your societies who are mandating the war. And they try to
it's
imply
a narrative, right? So the military,
well, that's a narrative, exactly. And they try to apply that to climate change, and I just don't think we're going to make progress if we wait until there's a single strategic narrative. I don't think that's the way to go. But the question is also right in the sense that not all of those 10 that I've offered and others as well, they're not all equally constructive in the sense that they'd be open to cooperation. I mean, I said some of them are more antagonistic to others. I mean, I can't quite see how you can square Naomi Klein's dismantling of capitalism with a worldwide carbon trading scheme. That doesn't seem to sort of fit together. So some of them are more antagonistic than others. And clearly those that are very skeptical of climate science and think the whole thing is a conspiracy are going to find very difficult ways. But it's not impossible. And I think even there, you know, if you can just recognize, well, what is the underlying fear or suspicion that animates that particular skeptical narrative, rather than just demonizing it as a narrative that should be flung into outer space and never heard of again. Actually try to understand what is driving that. And this is back to this idea of story listening. You know, policymakers would be well advised to listen to those types of, call them minority or skeptical narratives. Be well advised to listen to those to understand what is actually driving them, and to find ways of diffusing some of their more destructive powers. So I think there are tactical ways. I guess it's a case of tactics. Certainly, if you're a political being with political responsibility, is to think tactically about how you can both listen to the stories, but also find pathways or certain alliances in order to achieve more limited goals.
Great. This is a very good ending point, I believe, for our story, because our time is up. And so I'd like to thank you again, really from the bottom of my heart for joining today, and sharing your insights with the Northwestern and the larger Buffett community. I'd also like to thank everyone for joining today's webinars. The participants will receive a survey link at the end, and we hope you can share your feedback. And it also gives you a chance to sign up for our further announcements if you haven't done so yet. And just as a last comment, the last event of the winter series will take place next Tuesday, March 16th, same time. And it will feature Northwestern Professor of Political Science, Kim Susewa, who will talk about climate justice, environmental justice, and indigenous rights. And then we will begin the spring series on April 6th, I believe, focusing on SDG 10, reduced inequalities. So until then, be well, stay healthy, and we'll see you next week, I hope.